So I think education is obviously a big piece here, and we've focused quite heavily on that. I guess what other mitigations should we be considering? And again, kind of going back to reframing the discussion of, if we have time, resources and money, where should we focus these over the next 5-10 years to actually try make that change? So, some other ideas could be, you mentioned it before, alternative water supplies. So should we be considering wastewater treatment? And if so, how do we make that palatable to the industry? To the public. Similarly with the industrial side of things, how do we work with industrial clients, as you mentioned in episode 1, to actually look at, the abstraction consents and say, well, actually, there is a bigger focus on water reuse now, or there's a bigger focus on improving your efficiency, because your abstraction consent is going to be limited. However, we'll support you in trying to get that, improve your efficiency on that. So those are some other levers that we can pull. I was just wondering if anyone has any thoughts on, where we should be focusing our attention, or if there's other mitigations I haven't considered.
Well, you mentioned the big centralised recycling schemes, didn't you? Yeah. And I guess there's the decentralised version of that as well. Like, I work with a lot of people that deal with on-site wastewater systems, and a lot of them are pushing quite hard for facilitating grey water recycling at a very decentralised, in your home type level. Mainly, in this scenario, mainly because it's easier on septic tanks and at the wastewater treatment plant end. But actually, if we could facilitate grey water recycling at a wider urban scale, that's a great opportunity to reduce our outdoor water use, which is a huge component. So I think there's like the water recycling and household rainwater tank and the little grey water recycling scheme, and then there's the stuff you talked about earlier, like the big desal, the big wastewater recycling plant, the resource recovery facility of the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's those options, I think, just need to be part of the mix. Like looking far enough ahead in the future and working out what can be done, what the potential costs are, putting them all out on the table, and figuring out what is acceptable. Because I think depending on where in the country you are and what the community is like, the answers could be completely different.
Obviously, in a lot of places we've already got heavily centralised systems, and wastewater is that consistent flow. There's no seasonality, very limited seasonality to it, so it's a nice, especially for non-potable demand within non-residential sector. In parks where I came from in Australia, we built a non-potable recycling scheme, but it was for irrigating playing fields, and there was complexity around meeting supply and demand in summer, because that's when your demand is highest but your available water's the same as it was. So you need some seasonal storage and some smarts around it. But we overcame that through all kinds of smart control technology, monitoring and reservoir placement and this kind of thing. There's always a way to do it. Cost is obviously the barrier. And then there's something we already do is indirect potable reuse. We discharge effluent into rivers and then take that, and if we just make that more explicit, and you can discharge into maybe large storages, or like the lakes up in Timor or something similar, but highly treated wastewater into those, purified, I should say, recycled water into those or managed aquifer recharge, like you talked about, Lesley, where it's stuff that we need to develop the capability in, though. It's because I think managed aquifer recharge in particular can go wrong as well as it can go right. So, but there's a limited precedent at the moment.
Yeah, I really hope we're exploring all of those options before, like Australia, we get to the desal option, because I've been engaging with the Australian Water Services Association for years, and I'm constantly impressed and amazed at how sophisticated some of the Australian thinking is around their role in the circular economy and being energy efficient suppliers and very conscious of climate change and climate issues. But then whenever you look at the hard data of energy use by water networks in Australia, it's just this massive upward trend, and they've got such high emission factors, like the greenhouse gases that goes into the energy systems is so high, and so that climate change lock-in of the desalination plant, like now we're desalinating because we had these climate pressures, now we're creating more climate change because of the desalination. I really hope that we can take action before we find ourselves in that space.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of that last resort, isn't it? Option of last resort, I would say. And even if you've got a prime location and everything, it just doesn't, to me, it doesn't stack up for a lot of reasons at this point in time when there's so many options in front of it. That would include, like we haven't really talked, mentioned water loss in the previous episode, but there's also, the water efficiency, driving down consumption. Again, you might be able to get a yield out of that that's comparable to what you might seek out of a desal plant as a contingency measure. So,
yeah, and I think I like how you put it on that kind of episode 1 there is, and even how you reference it in the earlier sort of framework discussion as well, around actually trying to look at that kind of what the spend is going to be on that. So let's take water loss for an example, and let's look at repairing and replacing underground pipes. Yes, it might be a high cost to that, but over the lifetime of those pipes, what is the cost versus the water you're essentially producing by saving that? So if you're talking 10 megalitres, what's the cost of building a 10 megalitre plant versus, repairing enough pipework to replicate that, and over the lifespan of the pipe versus the treatment plants, what are you actually looking at? So I think that's, I guess, where we need to focus some of the attention, because like I say, it's not always about bringing on new sources, bringing on more production, particularly if you're losing a large amount of it, and particularly where New Zealand, as mentioned, doesn't have that storage capability. So we are affected a lot more by seasonal patterns year on year, as opposed to having that kind of longer buffer where we can say, well, actually, we know we've got a problem, we know we're going to have it face it in 3 years, this is what we need to do in between. It's kind of, we need to react now to the issues in front of us, and then hopefully by next year we would have got a little bit better so the issues aren't as great. So I think I agree on that one. The other one which I wanted to touch on again, and you mentioned about the grey water recycling, grey water reuse. I do wonder around that sort of area, where we have centralised systems currently, where we have existing households, and that actually making that grey water split per household can be quite expensive. But again, I guess this is where we need to look down that regulation path on new subdivisions, new buildings and whatnot, to see whether we actually drive some of that there. So again, it's trying to tie together, and again, that's a council-driven function to a large degree in terms of resource consents. How do we actually tie what the Water Department of Accounts is doing back into that new infrastructure, and actually say all new household subdivisions have to have that grey water split? So it's actually, I guess, looking down that avenue there and put it on to new developments, so at least we start making progression towards that, as opposed to just saying, oh, that'd be nice to have, but it's too expensive to do to existing infrastructure.
Carpety Council's gone down that route, and like there's definitely benefits to it, but we've got to consider the whole of community cost, right? So whether council, I think council can provide the cheapest water supply.
Yes.
And, because it's very expensive to do that, and it just pushes the cost onto the homeowner. So, and then you've got the vulnerable sector of the community that will never be able to afford to do a grey water system, or a large rainwater tank. So, yeah, there's a balance there, because there's economies of scale. So you might have distributed systems that there's also opportunities on a clustered distributed system scale. So like you might have a new development, and you might have a small, like a mini centralised plant for wastewater treatment and maybe even recycling. But, there's the economies of scale that need to be evaluated in that process. Because I think, like when you look at the data from Water Services Association Australia in terms of the cost of these rainwater tanks actually sit, going to rainwater, but grey water's there as well, probably even more expensive, at the very high end of the cost, whole of community cost. So, that's why that framework for evaluating these things is really valuable, because you can make the decision, but you've got the evidence base for it.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
I think it's also a bit of a utopia to position to be thinking about we'll be mandating recycling initiatives, because at the moment we've got so many barriers to even just people who are willing and keen to implement them. So I think some of our first steps need to be around providing clear public health guidance about safe grey water use that empowers councils to let homeowners make those decisions for themselves, and taking away some of the consenting barriers to putting a rainwater tank on your house. Because the former chair of our water efficiency group talked about her house building process. She is the most passionate water efficiency advocate you'd ever meet, and she was beaten down by the building consent process to the point where she just walked away. After years of trying to get a rainwater tank on a brand new build, it was too hard. So I think there's actually barriers that we need to strip away before we even get to the point of providing, well, incentives are nice too, I guess. You can have carrots and sticks, but I'd say some public health guidance around water recycling, really, really important enabler for the future, and looking at how a consenting system can facilitate more efficient builds.
There's a really interesting case up north of an area that's got towns that are on rain tank supply exclusively. It's all private tanks, and contemplating a shift to a centralised supply. And it's quite a fraught question. It's not straightforward, and there's supply options that are available to them. There's only really one that could do it wholesomely, or fulsomely into the future. Otherwise, it's a mix of sources and options. And in the end, I mean, the most cost-effective solution is going to integrate those existing tanks. You'd imagine. Like, it's going to be a complex scenario because there's not a lot of precedent for that, where you've got our primary, let's notionally say it's the primary source for the town, and then you're supplementing that with a centralised, reticulated supply potentially. And it's, the costs could be very, will vary widely, quite wildly between different options. But it's, they're facing a real question, and but they also, like every council, are very heavily financially constrained. So it's a real challenge.
So I guess if we kind of bring this back and reframe this to the initial question, I guess we've talked about a range of mitigations, from new water supply sources to potentially reuse, also looking at how we can reduce our water loss, and working with industry to potentially reduce their water usage, and again, education to the public. I guess from each of you, what I'd ask is, if you had the time, the money and the resources to work on one of these over the next 5 years, what would be your top priority? I think we'll start with you again, Lesley.
Well, I think I will be cheeky and choose one that kind of embraces them all, and go with Julian's levelised cost framework, where you having a structured way that puts all the options on the table and that considers them from a whole of life perspective. So what's the energy use, what's the ongoing operational, what are the trade-offs that we make environmentally, so that the whole suite is being considered. I think that would be my number one on my wish list, is that New Zealand has a framework to support them to make these decisions from a suite of options. Yeah, very nice.
I'm not allowed to say like reversing climate change, so we don't need to deal with the droughts or anything. But assuming unlimited budget, maybe just like 1% of the world's GDP or something like that. But I guess I totally agree with that, and I think at least from a pure engineering perspective, it's wastewater reuse. If there is no other available water source choice that is treatable, reliable, whatever, because wastewater is it's there, and be it for drinking water or for other uses to supplement the drinking water which we might be using to water fields or gardens or whatever, then that, I think, is a low-hanging fruit. Expensive, but it will always be there.
Yes.
Well, I'm already kind of doing it, but it's much harder without the unlimited budget that you're talking about. So I'm trying to build a bit of a community practice about water literacy and valuing water, and trying to, one day get to a point where it is becoming more of a national conversation. And then to go with that, though, I'm going to be the nerd that pushes demand management, because it's, like I've mentioned before, it's really cheap. And it, from a sustainability perspective, to mana o te wai, just about every perspective, it should be a no-brainer. Like, it's because it's just developing the capability to do it. And you know, meters is, in some cases, could be considered an important precursor, because if it's hard to save water if you don't know how much you're using. But nevertheless, it's still, like, non-residential customers are being metered, so we're, you know, working on that at this point. So yeah, just pushing the demand management barrow to push into the framework that Lesley, you know, brings to fruition for us.
This is rough, because I concur with all of these. I don't know, I think for me it would be going with the low-hanging fruit. As Jonathan said, it's working with what we've already got in terms of using the data that we have to develop smart water networks, digital twins, things like that. Oh man, it's just everything. I think it's the little things. It's fixing the pipes that we've got, making sure that investment is appropriate for what we need to do over the coming future years. It's having a long-term plan for if things do get really bad, but doing what we can to make these small incremental changes to also not end up there in terms of education and working with what we've got.
I think the big one for me, as a starting point, and I think it kind of puts a framework around for a lot of what we've discussed here, is that probably the education to the public piece. I think when you can get everyday people to put value behind water and the water that comes out of the tap, and a bit more understanding as to what goes into it, as opposed to this is just something that I'm entitled to, this is a right that I get this, to actually understand, okay, this is a finite resource. It is something that a lot of effort goes into making, a lot of cost goes into making, and I think that education of the public will actually help bring some of these other things to life, in terms of the discussion around reuse of wastewater becomes easier if people understand why we would even consider that. You know, because people might think, oh, they're trying to save some money, they're trying to, you know, they're trying to reuse wastewater. But actually that kind of education piece of, okay, we do have issues here, or here's some challenges, and here's one solution. So I think for me that, I guess, paves the way for some of the things that we've talked about. And I think it also makes the water loss, the metering aspect, and also the education around trying to reduce your own water a lot more prevalent, or it makes a lot more sense to everyone, as opposed to us just as an industry saying this would be great. So excellent. Well, hey, look, thank you all for taking time to join us today. It's been great to sort of work through this and just discuss some potential mitigations. And for everyone watching, thank you again for watching Lutra TV. Stay tuned for our next episode.